In 1863, Peter works as a slave on a cotton plantation with his wife, Dodienne, and their children. When he learns that he has been sold to a new owner, he spends his last moments with his family in prayer until white men come and drag him out, ignoring the children's pleas. Peter tries to resist, but the men do not hesitate to point their guns at Dodienne, so Peter agrees to get into the wagon. The white men beat him anyway before dragging him back. Peter and a group of other slaves are transported in a cage like cattle, and through the bars Peter promises his children that he will come back for them one day. After a long journey, they arrive at their new place of work, which happens to be a railroad construction site. Conditions here are 100 times worse than on the plantations. To make matters worse, they quote the Bible to justify their actions. There are also many vicious dogs that are sent to hunt down any slave who tries to escape. Sometimes he is simply whipped, sometimes he is shot in the middle of the camp, and sometimes he is branded in the face by Chief Fassel. Fassel has two helpers, Harrington and Knowles, who was also bought as a slave but chosen to be part of the guards because of his skills as a hunter. Peter does his best to behave, but even when he tries to help his friend Gordon when he falls, he is scolded for daring to do anything but work. One night, they watch as John is thrown into the cage, struggling in pain from his branded cheek. A slave named Tomas is trembling with fear, and Peter tries to comfort him by telling him to remember his loved ones and to think of this as just a job. Some time later, Peter overhears two white guards discussing some very important news. Lincoln has freed the slaves and now all those who managed to escape are running to Baton Rouge for help. The conversation is suddenly interrupted when one of the guards notices that Tomas has made a mistake with the food and wants to punish him, but Peter intervenes in his defense. The guard hits him before pulling out his gun and pointing it at Peter, but Fassel stops him, having taken an interest in Peter because of his attitude. When Peter is back in the cage, Fassel approaches him and tells him that he is his god and Peter is his dog. The next day, he puts Peter in chains and makes him kneel before him while his dog continues to bark and growl at Peter. Now the dog has learned Peter's scent. At lunch, Peter tells the other slaves about Lincoln and Baton Rouge, which they could reach after a 5-day walk through the swamp. Some of the slaves are hesitant because it is not easy to survive the swamps, but when Peter reminds them that they probably will not even survive this place, he gets support from some of the men. Now all they have to do is wait for the right time to escape. Some time later, a slave dies in the middle of work and the guards force Peter to drag him to the mass grave. Peter realizes that this is the perfect opportunity to put his plan into action, kills them with a shovel, and steals a knife before escaping. The other slaves take the opportunity to run as well, beating some guards and allowing John to steal a gun. The other guards sound the alarm and immediately begin killing as many slaves as they can before they reach the woods. Fassel can't stand that Peter got away with it and takes Harrington, Knowles, and the dogs in hot pursuit. Peter manages to team up with 3 of his friends and leads them through the forest. Eventually they find the swamps and most of the team have no trouble crossing, but Tomas freezes when he sees the crocodiles, allowing the dogs to catch up to him. Fassel approaches and demands to know where the group is going, but Tomas refuses to answer. This prompts Fassel to propose a deal. If Tomas tells him where the others are going, he will allow them to leave. Tomas confesses what he knows and is allowed to enter the swamp, but Fassel shoots him and lets the crocodiles eat him. Peter, John and Gordon manage to cross the swamp without any problems. Peter thinks they should cross the other swamps, but John does not take orders from anyone and decides to follow the path, feeling safe because of the gun he stole. Gordon wants to follow Peter wherever he goes, but Peter thinks it will be harder to follow them if they split up, so Gordon chooses his own path through the woods after Peter reminds him to follow the sound of Lincoln's guns. Peter discovers that his leg is bleeding from a bullet. He has to do something soon or the dogs will smell the blood. Moments later, Peter comes upon a house owned by a white family. Peter runs through the yard and steals a shirt before running off into the woods, but a little girl in the family sees him and alerts everyone by raising the alarm. Peter runs as fast as he can, stopping only to bandage his wound with the shirt he stole. A few moments later, he takes off the shirt that is stained with blood and hides it for the dogs to find while he hides under the water of the swamp. Fassel and his men fall into the trap and walk down the road, thinking that Peter has crossed the swamp. A crocodile takes the opportunity to attack him, but Peter pushes it away with a large branch before killing it with his knife. At that moment, Dodienne wakes up from a nightmare in which she saw her husband in danger. The children also wake up and worry about their father, but Dodienne promises that he is alive and will come soon because he has survived things that no other man could. As night falls, Peter hides in a treetop. Fassel and his men find the dead crocodile and open it to find that it is empty, meaning that Peter has escaped from here. The next morning, Peter continues to run, taking care to cover his body with mud and animal droppings to disguise his smell. As Fassel splits up his group to cover more ground, Peter is lucky enough to find an abandoned treehouse with clean water and some leftover food. There are also some coals, which Peter uses to heat his knife and cauterize his leg wound. Later, he uses the coals to make smoke to scare away the bees and approaches a beehive to get some honey. Fassel sees the smoke and heads in its direction. Peter also finds a boat, which he uses to cross the swamp and enjoy his honey. Fassel finds the tree house through the sniffing of his dog and is able to follow Peter's direction as he crosses the river. Peter hurries into the woods, where he is surprised to find John, who is angry that the white men will now hunt him as well. Peter swears that he is not being followed and teaches John how to hide his scent, but John ignores him before they continue running. A moment later, they hear the dogs barking and rush to hide. Peter goes into an empty log while John climbs to the top of a tree. The dogs manage to follow John's scent, allowing Fassel and his men to find him easily. John refuses to come down, so Fassel knocks him out with a shot before demanding information about Peter, but John refuses to say anything. Peter closes his eyes to avoid witnessing his friend's death and says a prayer for John's soul. After waiting a few hours to put some distance between himself and Fassel, Peter comes out and struggles to move on with the grief that is gripping him until he suddenly sees a group of horses pass by. Peter follows the direction they came from and finds a house on a plantation, but everything is on fire. It seems that the slaves here have also heard the news from Lincoln and have taken matters into their own hands. Peter enters the house and walks slowly through the rooms until he hears a strange noise coming from upstairs and follows it until he finds a dying little girl stuck in the rubble. Peter takes her outside. He is so distracted that he does not hear Harrington approaching until it is too late, and Peter must get away from the child or be shot. The child dies as soon as Peter lets go of her hand, and he is so enraged that he dares to turn violently and kill Harrington. Knowles arrives at that moment, but Peter grabs Harrington's gun to shoot him. When he hears Fassel approaching with the dogs, Peter decides to take cover in the cotton fields and shoots the dog when it gets too close. Fassel comes across the bodies of his helpers, which makes him even more determined to capture Peter. The next morning, Peter arrives at a beach filled with the bodies of white men who died in clashes with Lincoln's army. In the distance, Peter sees ships, indicating that Lincoln's men are close. Excited at the thought of finally reaching freedom, but suddenly Fassel appears and pushes him to the ground. Fassel pulls out his gun and reminds Peter that he is his god, but before he can pull the trigger, someone else shoots him first. Peter turns to see his rescuers, the Lincoln Native Guard led by Lieutenant Caillou. Peter's body finally succumbs to exhaustion and hunger, so the soldiers take him to their camp in Baton Rouge. When Peter feels better, he goes to one of the soldiers to get his new free man's papers, although he has to make up some information he does not know, such as his age. He is still not allowed to search for his family because white soldiers are taking advantage of the slaves and giving them two choices: work on federal farms or enlist in the army. Peter refuses to continue following orders, but when the soldier points out that enlisting in the army will help him save his family and be free forever, Peter agrees to enlist. Later, Peter discovers that the army has also found Gordon, who is wounded but alive. Then Peter goes to Caillou to get his uniform, but first he is asked if he is interested in helping the cause by posing for something called photography. Peter is skeptical, but Caillou promises that white photographers are harmless. It turns out that these men are photographing the reality of slavery for the world to see, and Peter agrees to expose his bare back to the camera, revealing the scars of hundreds of lashes. Caillou takes Peter and all of his soldiers to the trenches, where he reminds them that they are fighting for freedom. Peter is hit by an explosion that leaves him unconscious in a puddle for several minutes. He drags his aching body through the mud to continue his hope against the enemy. Caillou falls in the battle, and eventually Peter finds Gordon wounded. Seeing his friend in pain and fear causes him to come out of hiding and run toward the enemy lines. His intention is to stop the guns, and thanks to all the soldiers who see him as an inspiration and follow him, the native guard overcomes the enemies and achieves victory. Now that the war is over, the army visits all the plantations to free the slaves. He sets out to find his family and almost has a breakdown when he cannot find them. However, as he begins to recite a prayer under his breath, he turns his eyes to the side and allows God to guide him to finally find his wife and children, who run to him to embrace him. The photograph of the Real Peter became an icon of history and traveled around the world several times. In 1863, thanks to Lincoln, more than 400,000 blacks escaped to freedom. By 1865, nearly 4 million slaves in America were recognized as free. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching.